So as Joe said, thanks for coming out on a dreary Monday morning. Last time it was snowing, so this time it's raining. I'm thinking next time it's going to be beautiful and sunny, and then no one will want to come because it's too nice outside. They'll want to take the day off. So let me tell you a little bit about myself so that you know where I'm coming from with this program, my collection development experience. As Joe said, I am the editor for reference and collection management topics at Booklist magazine, which means that I edit all of the reference reviews, and I write feature articles on various collection development topics. I manage 2 online newsletters, one of which is called Corner Shelf, and it's devoted to collection development and reader's advisory topics. Prior to coming to Booklist, I was a librarian in here, actually, in the western suburbs and in the city for about 12 years. And I've worked in adult services departments doing reader's advisory and department manager duties at small suburban publics, medium to large suburban publics, and I was a collection development specialist at Chicago Public Library for 2 years. All of my jobs included purchasing, weeding, and budgeting, so I have lots of hands-on experience in that area. And this program kind of came about, it started, I've done it a couple times for various library school classes, so that's kind of the approach that I'm taking with it. It is very basic, so I will apologize to any of you who are already doing fabulous things in collection development. This is really geared towards people who might not have had much collection development talk in grad school, because I know I didn't. I went to Dominican, and my program, they only offered a collection development class every third semester, and I went straight through in 3 semesters, so I missed it. And we talked about it maybe in one session during the public library management course, and that was it. And everything that I learned on the job, which is not a bad way to learn, actually. You learn hands-on. And in my experience, I've worked at several different libraries through my career, and everybody did something a little bit differently, so I picked up different things here and there. So I'm hoping that even if you are already well entrenched in collection development, there might be some things here that, I didn't really think about doing it that way, or here's something a little bit different, or how you can apply it to what you're doing. So hopefully it won't be too terribly basic for you. And I've also left some time at the end for questions, or just chat if people want to talk about the things that they do or you're doing or thinking about. We'll have time for that. So basically, the things that I cover, as I said, are very basic, and I'm also assuming that you already have rituals and plans in place for the things that you already do. So I'm not trying to change anything you're already doing or give you something from the ground up. We're not going to talk about how to set up vendors or opening day collections or anything like that. I should also note that I'm coming at this from a public library perspective because that's my experience. But most of the items that we are talking about today really apply to all types of libraries because it is so basic. So let's just get right on into the swing of things. Nuts and bolts of collection development. So as we go through this session, I would like you to approach everything that we're talking about with this in mind. What is your focus? What are you looking for your collection? Determine the focus of your collection development needs. Do you have a good collection that could be great? Are you in maintenance mode for your collection, or does your collection need an overhaul? So if you have a good collection that could be great, just kind of think about, okay, my collection's in good shape, I have a good depth of coverage with materials that the patrons are actually using, I've got a budget that allows me to try new things, we've got the physical space to grow and expand our holdings, that's great. You can think about things from that perspective. If you're in maintenance mode, most libraries probably find themselves in maintenance mode, whether it's due to circumstances of the holdings or because of a static budget. Maybe there's not any money to grow, or maybe things are just fine and that's the way they are right now because there's no room for growth, or you just weeded maybe 2 or 3 years ago, so maintenance mode is good. That's a fine place to be, and I think you just need to make careful decisions about what happens then in the future for your collections. And if your collection is in need of an overhaul, I'd like you to think about how long it's been since your shelves have been weeded. Do you find that patrons are grumbling about the things that you have or the things that you don't have? Do you have to do more ILL than should be necessary in order to fulfill patron requests? Then that's sort of the way you should be thinking about this stuff, is how can I lift myself out of that and get into an overhaul? So the way that you budget, the frequency with which you weed, and the way that you write a collection development plan is determined by what stage you're at out of these 3 stages. So that's just kind of I'd like you to think about those things as we discuss stuff. Where are you in this process? Bless you. So talking a little bit, a brief look at where to get materials. So for most libraries, the two big vendors are Ingram and Baker and Taylor. And I'll talk about some school library stuff in just a second. So I've worked with both, and most of you have probably worked with both. And honestly, I think that they're very similar, and they each have their own perks and quirks. I can't say that I prefer one over the other. Many libraries work with both at the same time. They have one as their primary vendor, and one is kind of the backup for stuff that their primary can't get them. So your library probably already has one of these two selected as the main vendor, and if you're happy with them, that's great, don't worry about it. If you're not, I would suggest setting up an appointment with a rep from the competition and see what they have to offer. Your library or municipality may or may not have a contract with that vendor, so check with your director before you do that kind of stuff. Don't just go switching and find out, oh look, you're breaking your contract. But it definitely, what I always found was I would get to somewhere and we'd be using one of them and no one could tell me why. It's just been because, well, that's been our vendor for 10 years. That's been our vendor for 20 years. And people would sort of grumble about that, well, they don't know, I'm so tired of this, or this is clunky to use, and I'd kind of be like, why haven't you checked out the competition? So I'm trying to just kind of encourage you that, you know, they both do wonderful jobs at the things that they do. They have their own kind of materials that they offer. They have select services that they offer. So if there's something that you're thinking, boy, you know, every month when you go to put in an order and you think this is just, it takes up so much time, or something should be easier about this, go ahead and contact that other vendor. They would love it. And see what they can offer you and what. Because, you know, honestly, the pricing between the two is virtually the same. You're not going to get a better discount from one than the other. So don't, you know, you can kind of go between and see what's going to work for you best. There are also a number of smaller vendors who are very useful to have a working relationship with as well when the big guys can't get you what you need. And Amazon. Amazon is not a bad choice for libraries to use when you need something as a fill-in that you can't find elsewhere, or you need something fast. You're not going to get processing, and you might not get, you know, the best discount that you could, but it's useful to have that, and you can set up a library account with Amazon as well. For replacement titles, which we'll talk a little bit more when I talk about weeding, for replacements, particularly older hardcovers, online used bookstores can be a godsend. A-Libris and Abe, A-B-E, are two of the main ones, and they love to work with libraries. They will set up a library account for you, they will do purchase orders, etc. And I would also encourage people to scope out your local used bookstores as well. I've had wonderful relationships with them at various libraries that I've worked at. And there's nothing quite as gratifying as trying to fill in holes in a series, for example. And it's been long out of print, you can't get the first, second, or third ones, and you go to your local used bookstore and, oh look, they've got a pristine hardcover of something right there, and it's like $4. That's like, you know, the library miracle. And most of the time, I also find that they are very willing to work with libraries. They will set up a library account for you. You don't have to use your personal credit card, et cetera. They're happy to fulfill what you need. So go out and make those kinds of relationships. I know that bookstores are few and far between these days, but used ones are still out there and they're still surviving. I mean, Half Price Books is a chain, and you know you can find them most places. So definitely set up a relationship with a used bookstore. You'll be happy that you did when it comes to replacements. Talking about AV materials, those usually will come from Ingram or Baker and Taylor as well. There's Midwest Tape, Amazon, and you can often go direct from places like Recorded Books or Books on Tape. The actual publisher will sell to you direct. When it comes to youth materials, there are lots of smaller vendors at play, such as Follett, who is local to us actually. And one of the benefits to using those smaller vendors is that they can offer more personalized service for your collection, or particularly if you're working in a school library. They definitely, you know, that's their focus. That's what they do. It's pretty much all they do. So they can offer a lot of those specialized materials, selection lists, promotional materials, et cetera. So having a relationship with smaller vendors is key for youth materials and school libraries. Youth services folks also tend to see a lot of salespeople, a lot more than adult does. Marshall Cavendish, Sharp Reference, you know, those are some of the ones that I'm acquainted with. And it might kind of feel like a pain out of your day to meet with a sales rep, but they really only come around maybe twice, 3 times a year. One of the nice things about dealing with a salesperson like that is you get to view the materials before purchasing, and a lot of times with children's materials that's important. You know, you want to look not only at the content right in front of you, but you want to look at the material itself. Does it got sturdy binding, et cetera, et cetera? And especially if it's a publisher that you're not familiar with and don't already have a lot in your collection, it can be really useful to have them come in, you know, for a half an hour of your time, hour max. They often bring you things like donuts and coffee. So go ahead and make those appointments with your vendors, your sales reps. Right? The Christmas candy box. Come on, right? She knows what I'm talking about. So that's just a little bit on vendors there. So the process. What is the process like of ordering materials at libraries? Smaller libraries may have only 1 or 2 people who order everything. Sometimes it's the adult services manager, sometimes it's even the director, depends on how small you are. Smaller libraries also might get everything pre-processed because they don't have the staff or the time to do it, or since the volume is so small, they might do it all in-house. It really depends. Medium to large libraries generally assign different DUI areas to different librarians. There may be an acquisitions person in tech services who actually places the orders based on direction from selectors. I realize that this is, you know, taped and going out and nobody else can answer this question out there, but for those of you in the room, how many of you actually still go through and have like your copy of Booklist or your copy of Library Journal and you circle things and you hand it to somebody in tech services? So that does still happen. That's one way to do it. I mean, it works, right? And especially if you're small enough and you can have somebody that does that, that's great. How many of you are selectors already, that you already have your own section that you select for? So most of you, okay, that's good. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, every library that I've worked at has done something a little bit different. And I think that, you know, as evidenced in this room, you will find that you've got your process. In larger libraries, do any of you have someone who is like the one selection specialist that orders everything? A couple of you. Okay, good. See, there's lots of variance here. So larger libraries might have selection specialists. They might have, I think the notion of having a whole collection development department is sort of, you know, now that budgets are tight and people are needed to be working out on the desk and do regular reference stuff, that's sort of going by the wayside. But, you know, central collection development still exists, especially in your bigger libraries. And no matter how the actual ordering itself is done, the words of encouragement that I like to have talking about process is that a good relationship between the selection people and the tech services people is vital. Tech services might actually be doing the actual order placement for you. They're going to be doing some of the processing, and libraries really depend on tech services to get those items out to the patrons in a timely manner, ready to be used. So it really helps when the selection people and the tech services people have a good, harmonious relationship. You know, you all have to remember that getting the materials in-house and getting them out to people is everybody's job. And so I often find, you know, on my first week of any job, I find who are the key players in tech services, and I go make friends with them because they're the ones that are going to help me when I really need something quickly to get out on the shelves, or oh my gosh, I have to order 10 copies of something for something special. Can I get a rush on that? You know, it's important to make sure that everybody's working together, even if you know, one person is the selector. Everything doesn't all go through them. There's other people involved. So I just always like to put in a plug for let's play nice. So looking really quickly at review tools. The 4 major players are Booklist, Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, and Kirkus. That's 4, yes. For youth materials, there's the Bulletin of the Center for Children's Literature, the Horn Book, School Library Journal, and Booklinks, which is a quarterly supplement to Booklist. My advice on looking at journals has always been decide which one that you like best and stick to 2 of them. Maybe 3 if you've got a lot of time. But I really think it's too hard to try and keep up with all of them when honestly they largely cover the same books. If you look at 2 of them, you're going to find everything that you need. You're not going to be missing a whole lot. And also don't forget to use their online versions as well. So I'm going to take off my Booklist hat for a minute and give you some fair advice, but I have to warn you that, of course, I love Booklist the best because I work there, and I wouldn't work there if I didn't love it. So, but I'll talk just real briefly about what each of them is kind of like and how you can decide which ones to use. So Library Journal really is a great resource to have because they not only do reviews, they do a lot of news articles. If you're looking for, you know, what's going on in the profession and what's going on big picture on stuff, Library Journal is great for that. They are fairly expensive, and they only cover adult reviews, so your library has to also have a companion subscription to School Library Journal if you want to get the youth materials as well, and that can get really kind of expensive. Booklist, therefore, is not as expensive because we also cover youth materials in the same issue, but the thing to note about us is we are recommend only. So if you're looking for a review that's going to tell you that this isn't very good, we don't do that. We just won't review it at all. So people kind of have to weigh that a little bit. Of course, I tend to think that our reviews are superior, but I won't make too much of a plug there. Kirkus. Kirkus is an interesting animal. I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it's been around forever. Virginia Kirkus started it in 1930 or 1940 or something, and venerable reviews. But then in 2009, they were going to shutter completely, and then someone bought them, and they went online only, and now they're back in print. The problem that I have always had with Kirkus, and this is just me talking, I've always found that their reviews are not as useful for public library selection. They are very critical. Sometimes overly critical, and they do a lot of quote-unquote serious literature rather than the genre stuff, and so I've often felt that when they do cover the genre books, they kind of treat it with a touch of disdain because it's popular reading. And that doesn't really help you make selection decisions. Like as a reader, that might help you decide, do you want to read this book or not? But if you're trying to find out, well, is this something that's going to fly in my collection? Is this something that will be popular? They don't really talk that much about that. So I've always they've always been at the lower end of my list. Publishers Weekly is nice because their focus, they're mainly geared towards booksellers. So they have plenty of critical reviews as well as positive. And so there's a very different slant to their reviews than the reviews that you find in Library Journal or in Booklist. They're not afraid to say if something isn't good because they're going to tell these booksellers, don't bother putting this on your shelves, only order a couple copies of this, and that can be kind of useful. But subscription to Publishers Weekly is very expensive, and coming out every week can be really overwhelming. You end up with this sort of stack on your desk that's like 6 months old, and then you're like, well, I've already bought all those books, so never mind. And I always found that Publishers Weekly always overwhelmed me. So that's sort of my personal take on the journals. So once you've decided on what your professional review sources will be, it's pretty easy to use them. I generally would read them from cover to cover. But if you are developing a particular part of the collection, if you're responsible for this certain selection area, you'll want to go directly to that section that you need, of course. It's easy. They all mark things that are starred, so your eye can quickly go to those things, and you can find out, okay, they star this, why, what do I need to have? I know that Library Journal and Booklist also do a lot of high demand stuff. They sort of mark stuff that they know there's going to be a lot of holds on this. The publisher is putting lots of money behind the publicity campaign for this, so you'll want to keep an eye out for it. So look for those kind of designations. And I also like to encourage people when looking at reviews to sort of read between the lines. Even in Booklist, where we are recommend only, after being a reviewer for many years for both Library Journal and Booklist, I became quite adept at letting the review readers know when something wasn't all that great without coming right out and saying it, because especially when it comes to fiction, a lot of that is subjective, and maybe I didn't like it, but other people will. You have to kind of take off your personal reading hat for that. But there are key phrases that you sort of pick up on. A review that says something is for larger public libraries only is a good cue that maybe it's, maybe you shouldn't spend your money on that if you don't have a big budget. That was always kind of the key word. Something noted that it's for special collections means that it's too academic for most general collections. So sort of, the more reviews you read, the more you can pick up on sort of the language that's there. We don't at Booklist, actually. Nope. We, at Booklist, since we've got some time, I'll take a moment here. So Booklist has a number of editors for different sections, and then we have freelance reviewers. And so the publishers send their stuff to us. The editors make the decisions on what gets sent out to reviewers, and that is based, it's all over, that's the hard part of selecting. We get, boy, I used to have these numbers memorized. Suffice it to say, it's hundreds every month of books that come in. It might even be thousands if I'm not thinking correctly. We get a ton of books that come in, and the editors have to go through each one and decide, is this going to make it to review or not? And a lot of factors go into that. Who's the publisher? Who's the author? What kind of publicity push is the publisher giving them? And most importantly, do I have a reviewer that can handle this material? It's a little different for fiction and nonfiction. When I do review reference materials, a lot of times I will look at something and say, I don't have a reviewer that covers law. So either I have to review it myself or it's not going to get covered. So there's a lot of factors that go into how it goes out. Back in the day, we used to have this, Booklist has got an interesting history. Way back at the beginning, they used to get the books from publishers, and then that copy of the book would go out. They had a reading committee across the United States. There were, 6 different librarians at various libraries, and that book would get mailed from person to person to person, and a little index card would go with it, and the person could initial and check off, yes, this is appropriate for a public library, no, this is not appropriate, and here's why. And in the Booklist offices, we have huge card catalogs with all of those cards in them. So you can go all the way back and see. And we love to look at things that are classics and stuff that maybe we rejected because the 6 librarians, 3 out of the 6 said no, this wasn't good for a public library. So yeah, that's the way things used to be done. And I think, I can't speak to the actual process at Library Journal, but I used to review for them, and it was the same thing. I was assigned to an editor there. She had a list of the things that I was comfortable reviewing under, and then once every 6 weeks or so, she would mail me something, and I would do a freelance review. So a lot of it now is just freelance reviews like that. So yeah, it's kind of, it's interesting coming from the library side and now looking at the review side, how, it's like how sausage gets made, you don't want to know, right? There's an old joke about that, right? You don't want to know how the sausage gets made, basically. So the other thing, when you're looking at how to find materials, don't discount materials that are out there, like the Borders monthly flyer, publishers' catalogs, materials from your vendors, especially those materials from your vendors, right? You're paying them. They have all of this stuff, all of these catalogs that they're willing to send out, all of these selection lists. Take advantage of that, absolutely. They want to sell you stuff, of course, so they publish all of these guides and previews and selection lists. I say take advantage of them. It's really wise to kind of use those as your starting point and then go to a source such as Booklist to actually read the reviews then. You can also often read reviews within the vendor's website. But do be aware that there's a lag time before those show up there, so I wouldn't always count on that. What I used to do is, the publisher's materials comes out, months in advance. Books are sitting there waiting to come out 6 months to a year before they actually hit the market. And those publishers are pushing all those catalogs at you and all those pretty glossy little, magazines that they send out. Start building your selection list off of that, and then take that sort of internal list when you're looking at your reviews. Like, oh, that's right, I remember I saw that in the Random House. They had a huge 2-page spread about that. It must be a big one. What's the review say? So kind of look at things that way. And then a little word on finding materials through blogs and websites. So as Joe mentioned before, Karen and I do this program that's called Readers, Writers, Books, and Blogs, and the URL is there. It's also on the handout. There's the full video that we did when we were here, and there also I have a link on the handout to the handout from that program, which is available on Booklist Online, and you don't even have to print it out or anything. It's all linked to the sites that we visited, so you can just use it to click off of. And I would never say to use a blog or a review website for strict collection development, but it's a great way to keep on top of things that are coming out, or to keep on top of things that are popular or going to be popular, or just what readers are interested in. If you kind of select a few blogs or book-related websites that interest you, then you'll be up on what people are buzzing about for personal interest. You can find a really good selection on that handout that I mentioned, and I hope you take the time to watch the program. It's kind of fun. I'll brag about it. So there's that. And then, a brief word on budgeting. So budgeting could actually be a class on itself. It has several weeks worth of classes on budgeting, so I'm just going to talk really, really briefly about budgeting in this session. After all, the selector or department head is usually just giving the total. Like, you don't have to worry about how you get to that total. It's usually just presented to you at the beginning of the year. X, Y, here's how much you have. The work on budgeting comes with allocating how those funds go into your collection. So the basic how-to on that is to figure the average price of books. Right now, average is about $18 for hardcover fiction, $25 for nonfiction. That's based on the retail price less the vendor discount plus any processing fees. So, it varies, but that's a good number to have in mind. So if you have, $1,800 in your reference budget for this year, you can count on getting 100 books out of that. That's actually wrong because reference books are more than that. $1,800 in your 400s. There we go. You can get $100 or 100 books out of that. So that's kind of where you can look at your numbers. And then the basic formula for figuring out how to allocate those dollars into the various Dewey sections that you're buying for is the percentage of circulation that section has should roughly match the percentage of budget that section gets. Now, couple words of being flexible on that. I always really encourage flexibility for budget allocations because I come from the school of thought that they should not be the same year after year. There's always something different going on in the publishing world. There's always something going on in the world around us in general. I always laugh every, 4 years when all of the political stuff starts happening. Your 300s and your 900s, you blow through your budget because all of these books come out on the various biographies of the candidates and all of the pundits that put their books out about, this is why you should vote this way, or this is why it's good to be this and it's good to be that, and you wipe out that budget buying those books because those are things that people are asking you for. You might not have planned on buying them. You might not want to buy some of them depending on who the author is, but when people are asking you for them, you have to buy them. So I would always laugh looking at that going, okay, well, we're halfway through the year and the budget for 300s is shot because all of those political books came out. What do I do? So I really, really encourage flexibility in that. Your budget, when you're looking at where things are falling selection-wise in your budget, that's never written in stone, right? That's not something that you have to submit to your village or your municipality and you have to stick to it. It's not a contract that says, yes, I'm going to spend $1,000 on books that are in the Dewey 500s. Like, you have control of switching that money up around, and I really encourage people to do that. I also think that I warn against trying to spend a set amount every month. I know a lot of libraries do that. And it is important for somebody to be keeping track on the bottom line and make sure that you're spending through that money properly. But there have been libraries that I've worked at that, okay, here's the budget allocation for the year. This person has that much money. This person has that much money. This person has that much. And so I'm just going to keep picking on the 400s. I don't know why. Because maybe you don't order a lot of dictionaries anymore. But foreign language materials are there. And so this person has $1,000 to spend, or I'll make it easy, $1,200 to spend, right? So they're supposed to spend $100 a month buying dictionaries, foreign language materials. And you can end up in a lot of trouble if you've overspent that because maybe you don't need $1,200 that year. Or maybe what comes out even worse is, what if you're going along and you're spending your $100 every month and at the beginning of the year, you're really reaching because nothing new has come out in dictionaries, right? Like, it's not like those things, right? And so you're buying all kinds of stuff that maybe your collection really doesn't need, but you've been tasked with spending $100 a month, so you don't want it to go away, you better spend it. And then come December, when, the end of your budget year, let's just say, and all of a sudden 4 new editions of something exciting come out, and now you don't have any money to spend because you're only supposed to spend $100 a month. That's always struck me as just not the right way to do things. So I'm just encouraging people to, if you need to take that back to your supervisor and say, well, Rebecca says I don't have to spend $100 a month. I'm saying it. I'm going to put it out there for everyone to record and hear and be said. I definitely encourage people to not look just at the numbers that way because I've worked in too many places where the collection is skewed because we've spent all of this money in the first half of the year because we felt it needed to get spent. And then when everything started coming out, you know, and in fiction it works the same way, right? Fiction has this real cycle of when things come out. There's a big rush of books that come out starting November, December, because they want to get stuff out by Christmas, they want to get it out by the end of the year, and then there's another huge bunch of books that come out in April, May, June because of summer reading. And if you're stuck at only spending a set amount each month, you're going to miss stuff, or you're going to be buying stuff that you don't really need. So that's I'll take off my little hat and get off my soapbox from that. But I do always like to tell people to think a little bit outside the box on your budget. So moving on to the actual materials in the collections. So looking at books, of course, a large percentage of materials budgets go to new hardcover books, whether you're talking about adult or youth. So paperbacks, where do those kind of fall in? Paperbacks versus hardcovers for replacements. Paperbacks are much cheaper, as you all know, but they also don't last as long, as you already all know. But most patrons like the size and the format of a trade paperback. So you have to kind of get out of a mindset of thinking that, oh, paperbacks are just not as good as hardcovers, because sometimes they are, and they're cheaper to replace if you need to keep, if you have to replace them every couple of years, they're inexpensive, so it's not bad. The real question always comes in when people wonder about what to do with their mass market paperbacks. Do any of you here in the room have collections of mass markets that aren't cataloged? You do, okay. I've worked in a couple libraries where, we've got these mass market paperbacks, and they're there to check out. They have barcodes, you can check them out, but you won't find them in the catalog. They're kind of considered a throwaway collection. And that's not always, that's hard sometimes, because I've always advocated it's better to have a mass market copy of something like, let's say Sue Grafton's A is for Alibi, right? That's always my classic example. Wildly popular series, people are being introduced to it all the time still. Every time she comes out with something new, they'll always want to go back, and you cannot find a hardcover copy of like A, B, C, or maybe even D at this point, because they didn't reissue them in hardcover. And I would rather have a mass market $4 copy sitting on the shelf right next to the rest of the hardcovers that you're going to have to replace every 6 checkouts because it's going to fall apart, or someone's going to drop in the bathtub, or they're going to lose it. I'd rather have that than not have anything on the shelf at all. And that's kind of the way that I approach collections like that. And I'd also rather have it there on that shelf than sitting in a mass market spinner or somewhere where nobody's going to find it. So think about it. Think about things that way. Audio. So bye-bye cassette tapes, hello digital downloads. I don't know. Believe it or not, cars were still available. I looked this up for an article that I wrote last year. Cars were still available with tape players in 2010. At the time, we still had a car that was from 2002, and all it had was a tape deck. There wasn't even a CD player in there. But as late as 2010, they were coming with both options. So that's not that terribly long ago. Those cars are still on the road. Some people, not saying it's a lot of them, but some people still will use cassette tapes. And how about your older patrons? Maybe they're still using them. So when it comes to purchasing, I'm not even sure if everyone sells them as cassette tapes anymore. They might be all, only available, but what I'm talking about here is not so much purchasing them, but getting rid of them. I wouldn't be so fast to weed all of them just yet. And I'm a big weeder. You probably might already know that about me. So if I'm telling you don't have to, then maybe you're like, They tend to be self-weeding because, they're not as durable as everything else is. And I would just look at the circulation records on those. If some of those are still going out, if you still have patrons who have a car that's got the tape player in it, or you've got, your homebound patrons that still have their cassette player, it might be okay to hang on to those. But check your circulation records before you just decide to get rid of the entire collection. The last library that I worked at, we really were dying for space in the audio section, just dying for it. And so we initially decided we were going to get rid of cassettes wholesale. And we started talking to the people that we knew were checking them out. And after listening to them, we decided, well, all right, we're not going to get rid of it all, but we're really going to take a sharp look at what's been going out. And we decided to start pulling everything that hadn't circulated in 1 year. And then that way and that was sort of what we stuck to. And if it hadn't gone out, then it was time to go. So we greatly reduced the size of the section, but we didn't eliminate it completely. Now, when I do this program again in like 2 years, I will be talking about how those might already be gone. So we'll see what happens. The other thing is, with the advent of everything going digital download, some libraries are not only getting rid of the tape collections completely, but they're winnowing down what they're buying on CD. So, it's a time that's in flux. No one really knows kind of what's going to happen with those collections, so it's interesting. The same thing kind of goes with video, DVD, Blu-ray, and so on. It's unheard of to buy VHS anymore. I'm fairly certain they're no longer manufactured. I didn't look that up beforehand, but I'm guessing that nobody makes them anymore. And again, those collections, if you haven't already gotten rid of them, I think it's probably time to, or question who's actually checking those out and what they're doing with them, because I'm not even sure how easy it is anymore to buy a VHS player. I bought one, I will admit, I have children, so we bought one about 5 years ago, and it's a combo player. It's got the DVD and the VHS, and it was hard to find at that time. So 5 years later, I can't even imagine if you can still buy a VHS player or not. So we won't spend too much time talking about that. But DVDs, a lot of libraries are thinking, well, do I buy the DVD or do I buy the Blu-ray version, or do I buy both? It really depends on your patrons and what players that they have. So again, and what's more expensive than the other? It's kind of, you always have to look at what are people checking out and what can they use. There's been a lot of libraries that I've been in that they're all excited to get the Blu-ray, and then they discover that 70% of their users don't have Blu-ray players, they just have the plain DVDs, and so those movies just sit there pristine on the shelf. So got to sort of think about that. Who's checking it out and what device do they have? So how many copies to buy of anything, no matter what format? The formula there is really based on your collection size and your circulation numbers. Popular authors, you should kind of have a standard formula for that. You could even have the auto purchase set up from your vendors. Both Ingram and Baker and Taylor offer plans where you can say, anything that comes out from James Patterson, anything that comes out from Danielle Steele, Stephen King, et cetera, you don't even want to think about that. You know that patrons are going to buy them. You know that you're going to have a hold list, so you automatically buy 4 copies of it, or 10 if you're lucky, or 2, or whatever. You kind of do that. Every library should already have something in place about how many you buy for holds versus how many holdings you have. So think about that when you're buying stuff. I think it's always better to anticipate demand than have to go back and make people wait longer for you to get that second copy of stuff. So that's sort of my encouragement on that. So weeding. Weeding is a critical part of any discussion on collection development. As I kind of mentioned, weeding is sort of my thing. All of the libraries that I've worked at, I've had crazy weeding situations, and that has really sort of shaped my thinking on weeding. But basically, think about it at the bottom line. You can't just keep buying new items without getting rid of old ones. There's nothing more to be said than that. We do not have ever expanding shelving. We don't have buildings that grow. You're limited to that sort of thing. So weeding, of course, I could spend more than an hour talking about weeding, and in fact, I believe I will be. As part of this series later this summer, I have a book coming out through ALA Editions that's called The Weeding Handbook, a shelf-by-shelf guide, and that is supposed to be out in June. And so, Joe, we're going to come back and do that as part of this series. We're going to do a weeding program this summer, so look for that on the RAILS website. So I won't talk too much about weeding in this. But if you are interested in learning more about weeding, the book that I wrote is based off of a popular series of articles that I write for my Corner Shelf newsletter. And you can find those on Booklist Online by simply searching for weeding tips in the title. And you can see, I've just did a little screenshot there. What I've done is literally gone shelf by shelf. Here's a column on weeding your 100s. Here's a column on weeding your 700s. Here's a column on weeding your AV materials, and sort of big picture stuff on weeding. So I won't take up too much of today's time talking about weeding, just that you really, 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 really need to do it. And we can talk a little bit afterwards if you want to about weeding.
Would that be this website on the back?
Yes, I believe I've got it there on the handout. Yep, booklistonline.com. And if you search, if there's a search box on the left side of the website, where you can search by title, and the title of the columns always starts off with weeding tips. So just search that and you'll get that listing right there. It comes right up. And those are all available. I should mention, those are all available on Booklist Online for free, whether or not you have a subscription. Many of our articles you do have to be a subscriber to get, but we've made these all public. So, because everybody needs to know about weeding. That's my plug on that. So moving into working with your community. So working with your community is a very important part of collection development. No one works in a vacuum. These are not our own personal libraries. We can't just buy what we want. So working with the patrons is what's important. And how do you kind of ask what is it that they want and how do you find them out? There are a number of ways to do that. A lot of libraries once a year or so will do surveys to find out. You know, you've got put the little half slips of paper scattered throughout the collection, put them at the circulation desk, put it at the reference desk where people will find them that just says, you know, please tell us, what are you interested in? Did you find what you were looking for today? What do you think we should buy more of? What collections, when you come in, what do you check out? You know, what are you looking for? And that's a good way to just get quick, easy information on what people want. Working on the desk is a really important part of collection development. You might not think so, but it is. You are there on the front lines. You're hearing what people are asking you for every day. You're listening to the kinds of authors that they're asking about. You're listening to them tell you if they found what they needed or not, and that's kind of how you get to know and grow your collection. Pulling circulation records and reports is really, really important. I know, you know, every catalog has that function that you can pull the records from, so use that. You know, sometimes you have to get them to pull them for you, or someone has to be designated as the person that can log in and do it, but those records exist, and use those to see, you know, what's going out, what areas are people interested in. So buying what your patrons want. I don't think that there's any class or session that can teach you that. It's something that you know intrinsically just from being there on the desk and talking to people, and knowing the patrons that you're buying for. When I worked at Elmhurst, I worked over here at Elmhurst Library for 2 years, and that is a nice sized library in a well-off suburb, and we had lots of money in the budget at the time, which was awesome. And I could buy pretty much anything that I wanted. Anything that got a good review, I could put it in my basket and buy it, because we had the money to do that, and we had a very well-read reading public that would read even, you know, the kind of the smaller press stuff, esoteric things. I could do that. I had the money to spend. I had the patron base that would read the books. When I've worked in smaller libraries with smaller budgets and different reading populations, I think that it's often harder to work in a smaller library because you're a little more restricted. I had to be very careful with my money. And there's a library I'm thinking of in particular where we had a much older reading population. And I always had to ask myself, would my little old ladies like this book, right? So at the time that I worked there, chick lit was huge, really, really popular. And of course, there were always a ton of books that I was reading the reviews that I wanted to check out, and I wanted to read them, but I knew that they wouldn't circulate, so I couldn't. So you have to kind of, always sort of remember, who is the person that's checking this book out? Do I have anybody that would be interested in that? At a different smaller library that I worked at, we had a very well-educated reading public, but a very, very tiny budget. And in addition, my patrons were quite wealthy folks who didn't always like their tax dollars going to popular materials. So I had to be very careful. These were the people that were gonna come in and be mad at me if we had 3 copies of James Patterson on the shelf because, la-di-da. And why are you spending my tax money on that? And so I always had to kind of balance out what I was doing. There's a fine system to it, right? When I worked in a large system for Chicago Public Library, that's a whole different planet. I mean, that's something completely different. Knowing the different neighborhoods and what everybody was checking out in those various branch libraries was crucial. The way that we worked it there, I was in collection development was not centralized, but we did have a department downtown, and so I would create selection lists so that branches would have some kind of control over what they were buying, but it still came from a pre-selected list. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that. So why is it important to get buy-in from your community regarding these collection purchases? Well, that's kind of like, well, duh, because they're the people checking it out, right? That's why you have to have buy-in on that. Simple answer. But it also goes a little bit further than that. When you have community buy-in, you have fewer challenges to materials. And you have a little more freedom to make decisions when you know that your patrons will be happy with those decisions. Weeding can be a very thorny issue at times. Those are things that you have to frame in the positive. Weeding makes room on the shelf for new, fresh materials, right? And you're being a good steward of the public tax dollar by removing out-of-date materials that shouldn't be in circulation and replacing things. And so having a good relationship with your patrons, having them understand why you buy the things that you do is really kind of key. And to seg into that, you should have a collection development policy or plan that your public can be made aware of. So the key to success in collection development is having a well-written plan or policy. And I kind of use that word, it's, plan and policy are actually two very different things, but I'll just call it plan from now on. Policy is something that your board has to vote on, and it's something that you probably don't change very often. A plan is something that's more of an internal document that you guys can use, and it sort of ebbs and flows. But anyway, a plan or policy not only makes the selector's job clear, it protects you on if you're challenged on why you purchased a particular item or spent a particular amount in any certain section. So at most libraries, you should have one in place already, and if you don't, please find web resources and borrow what would work for your library. On the back of the handout, I do have, there's a directory of collection development policies on the web. I've got links to 2 local libraries who have had very, very good plans that are easily adapted to other collections. You can just take the language right from them and just shoot them an email and say, do you mind if we incorporate some of your plan into our plan? And I guarantee you they will say yes. And then there's also one for a school library there from the Georgetown, Texas School Library Procedures Manual. Those are really good examples, and I encourage everyone to go take a look at them and say, another good example, I forgot to link it here, and I'm very sorry about that, is a local one, is the LaGrange Public Libraries plan. Wow, that sucker is like 20 pages long, and it is detailed, and it is perfection. Like, they have covered every base. I apologize for not getting the link on there. They really, amazing. They really went through very, very thoroughly, updated it. It's wonderful. And not every library needs a plan that's 20 pages long. Just let me get that out there too. Sometimes your plan can just be a couple pages as long as you hit all of the basic points. And once you have a plan, I always encourage libraries to review and update it on a regular basis. This is another thing like your budget that shouldn't stay static year after year. I would say review your collection development plan every 3 years, revise it as needed, or at least once every 5 years, give it a revision, give it an update, because things change. If you still have something in your plan about buying VHS tapes, that's a good idea to revise it. So a collection development plan can be as simple as a few generally worded paragraphs or as detailed as a section-by-section overview of what's collected and why. And the examples that I'm giving, Morton Grove is very good for that if you're looking section by section. They have it broken down. Here's what we're buying in the 100s, and this is why. They don't give the budget figures there because that's something that changes every year, but they will say, we buy X, Y, and Z type of materials. This is what we're looking for when we buy it. We weed this section every 2 years because of currency, et cetera, et cetera. So anything that's got sections like that can be really useful. Make sure that even the simplest plans address the following things: how donations of materials are handled, because that always comes up; weeding justifications and processes for weedings; how to deal with book challenges, and we're going to talk about that next; and if your library has any special collections, such as local history or local authors, you should have procedures in place for those collections that are spelled out. So those are things that belong in a collection development plan. And again, collection development plans are something that could be a whole extra class on that, so we're just touching on it here. We're going to move along to, things I just talked about. Move along to book challenges. So having a solid collection development plan in place is your best defense when book challenges come up. When you have a document such as that, and especially if you display it online for the public, you will always have a leg to stand on. The plan should spell out what's acceptable for your collection and why you've decided that. An interesting thing to note is that reviews can help you make your case. I don't know if anybody really does this anymore, but back when I first started, the library that I first started working at, before I could buy something, I had to have 2 positive reviews to go along with it. And lots of my time was spent reading all of the review journals. But that was so that we could make our case, so that if a patron said, why would you buy this is a filthy book, or this is whatever, You could say, you know, these two prominent review sources have given this a positive review and have recommended it for public libraries, and that was our backup. So reviews can help you make your case, and it's particularly when you're talking about children's or young adult materials. I've often seen librarians refer to those reviews as their backup. Well, you know, School Library Journal gave this a starred review, and it's acceptable for all collections. So that's what we're going on with that. In addition, if a patron is arguing with you about a title, you can point out when the issue is, you know, language, sex, or adult themes, reviews are usually very careful to include that when they're talking about like young adult, for example. So you can say, we were aware of that. The review states that despite the language, this is something that teens will relate to, et cetera, et cetera. So don't be afraid to kind of use those as your backup. Have official procedures and forms in place. Every library should have a process for patrons to request that materials be removed from the collection. Those forms should be neutral in time, or neutral in tone, and most of the time they will require board action. You never know what's going to happen with that. And a good course of action, what I always kind of suggest is feel free to move something rather than remove it. I've never had to deal with a book challenge that resulted in a formal intervention by a library board. Was very lucky with that anything that came up as a challenge, I had several times when unhappy patrons, it always seems to be those YA books, right, that the people are mad about those. But you can often make someone happy by moving a title out of young adult into the adult collection. People can still check it out then, you're not banning it, you're not removing it, and you know, you can make a case for that. If the language really is particularly harsh or there's a lot of sex in it or violence, you can say, yes, this belongs in an adult collection, it's not really right for young adults. So I always gently suggest to move rather than remove. And I'm going to take a little moment here to tell you my favorite story about a challenged material. Do you guys, this had to be 2006, 2007, the movie Borat, okay? Right, the chuckles. You know, it's satire and it's gross. Right? And I had this woman who called. I was the head of adult services, so she called to complain to me. And I don't know if any of you have seen this, but briefly, the first 10, 15 minutes or so, if you don't already go into it knowing that this is satire, which hopefully you do, I don't know why you would want to watch it otherwise, but you know, it's supposed to be this fake documentary, right? And she was completely unaware that it was satire. She didn't know it was fake, and she only watched the first 10 minutes. So she thought that it really was this awful, you know, rude, politically bent, terrible documentary. And she called me and said, you know, I insist that you remove this from the shelves. How can you buy something like that? You at least need to go find a balanced documentary and I was like, lady, did you not watch what? Because I had just seen it too, like, you know, a couple weeks before. And I realized as she started to talk, I'm like, she didn't watch the whole thing. She has no idea that this is a comedy. She really thinks that this is a look at this country and it was amazing to me. So I had to have this like half an hour phone call with her where I just explained, well, ma'am, et cetera. And I had to say it very nicely, like, you know, hey, dummy, why didn't you watch the whole thing? But she didn't want to believe me. She's like, well, I'm not going to go back and watch it. No, I refuse, blah, 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 and I don't believe you. And I said, you know, ma'am, I can send you a couple of reviews maybe, or, you know, articles online that talk about how this is satire and it's not real. And we had this big discussion on why my tax dollars were being spent on junk like this, and et cetera, et cetera. And I had to go into the catalog record to see. Not only did we have one copy of it, but we had 3, which really made her angry. And I said, well, ma'am, you know, I'm looking at these copies, and I can tell you that each one of them is circulated, you know, like 50 times in the last 6 months. So maybe you don't like it, but your neighbors sure do. And then she went, well, I see. And that was the end of that. So and I just kept thinking, I'm like, we have a lot worse movies in the collection for you to get mad about if you want to. But it was just kind of, I was a little unprepared for that. But I could back it up by saying, well, you know, I'm looking at the circulation. Obviously, the only reason that we would have bought more than one copy, because at the time we didn't purchase a lot of movies, you know, it was usually one copy of everything. If we bought more than one copy, it was because there were, you know, 5 or more holds on it. And I said, well, your neighbors are watching this, so somebody wants it. And that made her happy, but, or not happy, but that kind of shut her up for a moment. But that's always been my favorite challenge story, was the woman who thought Borat was real. So. Oh, graphic novels, yes. Boobs.
Does not belong.
Yes.
The teen section,
Yes.
start an adult graphic novel section.
Yeah. Yes. And that's how you get around that, right? Instead of, because it's not only the young adults that are reading it, there are adults that are reading it too, and nothing's keeping the young adults out of that adult section, right? Like you don't, so that's kind of a good way, right. This is in the adult section. We have not, bingo. That's keeping that as its own thing is a really good idea, because yeah, those will get moms mad real quickly. So, looking beyond books to kind of wrap up here, take a few minutes to talk briefly about other materials in the collection, like video games and ebooks. So, believe it or not, sometimes these are still novelty collections in smaller libraries, so I think it's worth talking about them separately outside of the main parts of your collection. So video games, they have their own unique challenges. Multiple formats, multiple manufacturers, there are use issues, the rating system is always kind of tough, and the price can be hard to justify. One of the hurdles that is still kind of this weird gray area is the legal issues surrounding the circulation of computer software. Whether we as librarians like it or not, games are packaged and distributed according to the end user license agreement, which says they are meant for one person, and that is the person who is buying them. That's an actual contract that accompanies this product. I have yet to hear about a library that's gotten busted for that, and there are lots of libraries that have separate video game collections, and they promote them heavily, so you know the manufacturers know that those are out there, and if they're not bothering anybody, then there you go. But it is a gray area, at least pale gray. So you know, it was several years ago, libraries did start getting cease and desist letters from TurboTax. I don't know if any of you remember that. You know, you're not supposed to be circulating copies of TurboTax, and if they feel like it, they will tell you to stop and pull it, because those are meant for one user only. Those are not meant for circulation. So I keep kind of waiting for the day that the video game guys are going to come out and be like, what? We've never heard of this, but we didn't know you were doing it, which of course they do know. But one of these days they're going to decide they're not making enough money off of us, and they're going to want us to buy multiple copies. But the thing that's interesting about video games, you know, when I've talked about this before, it was never an issue, but now I think the biggest challenge on them is this going to become a dead or orphan collection because everybody's gaming off of apps instead, and it's all digital. So that's why I always kind of caution libraries to not invest too terribly much in those collections, because 2 or 3 years down the road, they might be dust collectors, and that's not something that you want, especially when you've spent $75 on a game. Particularly in tough budget years. It can be hard to explain to a patron why they're on the bottom of a hold list for the one copy you have of a new bestseller, but the library has money for video games. Like, that's another thing that can easily be challenged. So just kind of approach video games with a little bit of caution. If you have good circulation on them and you are finding it easy to buy them, then more power to you. That's great. Ebooks. Ebooks have their own unique challenges. The format can be difficult. Amazon won't always play nice. They don't want libraries loaning actual Kindles. They don't make the majority of their Kindle titles available in Overdrive. It's gotten better, especially in the last year or so, but there's still a limit. And just last month, Overdrive announced that they've been bought by the company that makes the Kobo reader, which is a competitor to Kindle. So who knows what's going to happen once that goes through. Maybe they're going to, I don't know, maybe who knows what's going to happen. I can't imagine it's going to be any easier. The loan structure can also be hard. HarperCollins wanting to limit circulation to 26 times, Random House charging 4 times the hardcover book price. I have been talking about ebooks in some fashion or other for over 5 years now, and we are still nowhere near getting it all figured out. You all know Veranda here at RAILS. She did a program at ILA this year that I attended, and I was listening to the panel, and I went up to her afterwards and we had this discussion that I felt like I had gone back in time 5 years, because we had the exact same panel at ILA 5 years ago, and the same exact questions had come up and they still hadn't been answered. So it's this weird, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I think that it's definitely something that needs to be put into your collection development plan. It's not anything that you should have set in stone, because it's very, very flexible. You know, also 5 years ago, Overdrive was the only game in town, and now very slowly but surely, other people are getting into the market. The 3M Cloud Reader, I think is what theirs is called. And thank you. Yeah, and somebody else has another big one too. Can't remember it. Oh, Access 360 from Baker and Taylor. So other people are trying to get into the market, but it's a slow process. And when you are limited to one vendor, you can be sure that they're not looking out for the libraries. They're looking out for themselves. That's their bottom line.
And I know that RAILS, here we have a consortium.
Yes, and working in consortium can be great for savings, but difficult for collection development. It's a trade-off. So, yeah, eBooks, again, that's a whole other hour-long plus session on themselves. Thinking about how the video games are a gray area, same thing with those Kindles. Do your libraries have Kindles that you circulate? Gray area. There hasn't been too much talk about it recently, but a few years ago there was big press when Amazon started sending out cease and desist letters to libraries. That's not what those are meant for. And great, get away with it as long as you can, but don't be surprised if Amazon sends you a letter with very scary legal language that says, no, we don't like that. So it's, again, gray area. And it's hard for libraries. We're trying to do what our patrons want from us and what's best for them, and thwarted at every turn. I know. So a way to kind of get around that, more and more, especially in the past year, some libraries are purchasing their own licensing agreements from Overdrive to go direct through the vendor. That can be a challenge because it's pricey, and Overdrive is the only game in town, really. And that sort of leads me into the next and final topic of discussion, which is self-published books. So 10 years ago, libraries would not have received a request for a book that was digital only. Those just didn't exist then, whether it was traditionally or self-published. But now, the recent figures from 2014, eBooks comprise 40% of self-published ISBNs. So, back in the day, you used to have the guy that would come in with his book or call you up and say, oh, I'm a local author and I've written my first book, would you please put it in the collection? And you had to try and figure out how to deal with that. But now you're getting people who are like, well, I wrote my ebook, and what are you going to do with it? And a lot of times you have to say, I can't do anything with it because we can't put it on a platform for people to check out. So that's kind of, it's this weird struggle, because this is definitely something that is happening, and libraries have to be aware of it. And the question of self-published or e-only titles is something that you can put into your collection development plans. Will you handle print self-published any different than you would handle e-only? And the answer to that is usually yes, because if somebody comes in with a physical copy of their book, especially if they're willing to give it to the library rather than make you pay for it, there's a different answer to them, whether you say, yes, we can put this in the collection, or no, it has to go under consideration, or no, it has to be reviewed somewhere, versus being able to say, no, I'm sorry, we don't have the capability to check out your ebook to someone. There's this kind of gray area too of self-e-published that's not really self-published, but it's not traditional either. And I'm talking about companies including CreateSpace, Smashwords, and Author Solutions. Those are three big companies who are self-publishing companies, but they can also do print versions. And Ingram and Baker and Taylor have contracts with them. Amazon does for a couple as well, where they can sell the print book as well. So assuming that you can buy that print copy easily enough from your vendor, are you willing to do so if it's a self-pub book? The other question that comes in is, how are you finding out about these e-only books? How are your patrons coming across them? Is this something that they're even asking for? The biggest question in my mind is, if we can't give our patrons access to the book, why are we getting worked up about it? And that's where that kind of licensing option from Overdrive comes into play. If you can, or any other vendor, I think Access 360 does that as well. You can upload things, a patron comes in and says, I've written my own ebook and I want you to upload it, and if you've got that capability, you can do it, you can circulating it. And that's a good way to sort of overcome that, but again, what's your rationale for selecting that or not selecting it? And this is a really great case for the soon-to-be famous Illinois Author Project that RAILS is co-sponsoring right here. Libraries are part of that review process and that vetting process. Last year, we covered those books in Booklist, and I hope that we'll do it again this year. And so you can say, oh, well, this is a reviewed book, actually. Of course we can put that in the collection. It got a good review. It won this award, et cetera. But that's really sort of, in its infancy. I know that I'm quite proud to be associated with a system that has picked up on that and is starting to do that. I'd love to see other library systems or consortia or libraries themselves across the United States do that as well, because people are coming in to ask for this kind of stuff, and we're still struggling with how to get it to them. And that is really the end of the prepared remarks. So we've got some time for questions or just general discussion about collection development. And I would love to have both our virtual viewers and our people here. My email address is right there, and I would love to continue chatting with you. But is there anything that anyone wanted to bring up or talk about or go into further? Yes?
We have a paperback classics
Okay.
section, and I think in our library we don't interfile paperbacks with hardcover.
Sure.
So I think it was just sort of like a receptacle for whatever.
Yeah.
So I was just curious if other libraries have that, or if it's necessary.
So I'm going to repeat the question just for the recording. So the question is, so her library has a paperback classics collection, which is separate from the main fiction collection, not interfiled, and she's just curious to know what to do with that, or if other libraries have that as well. Is that okay? So there's nothing wrong with having separate paperback collections. I personally, this is just me, I love to see things interfiled as much as possible, because as we all know, how many times does the patron just bypass the desk, bypass the catalog, go right to the section of the shelf where they think something ought to be? And if they don't see it, they just assume you don't have it. So if you have a separate paperback collection, I would just encourage you to market it and let people know about it. Have those books in the catalog for the people that are looking that up. I don't think there's anything wrong with having it, and there's certainly nothing wrong with having it separate as long as people are aware of it. If it's something that's collecting dust, then you have to start thinking about what its use is. What is it there for? Is it just so you can say, yes, we have a copy of The Man in the Iron Mask, but you're never going to find it? But it's think about what you're doing with that and how it's being used. Yes?
We didn't really talk about the nuts and bolts of how to weed.
That's weeding. Her question is about weeding. Yes, that is because that's a whole separate issue. I could spend a couple minutes on it here, just overview-wise. But hey, go out and buy my book and you'll learn all about it. No, just kidding. But truly, if you look at the weeding articles on Booklist Online, the very first one is called Weeding Tips, the Basics, I believe. And it's really nuts and bolts. It talks about running reports from your circulation system, how to decide. Every library is different depending on, when it comes to how long they're going to keep something on the shelf. That depends on how big your collection is to begin with, how big your actual physical shelves are. And so it's up to each individual library to decide, okay, we are going to weed everything that hasn't circulated in the last 5 years. Last 3 years. I've worked at places where it's the 1 year, because I've worked at libraries where it's one book in, one book out, because there is nowhere to go with anything. So that's something that has to kind of come internally from the library. The actual process of it varies also from library to library, but what I find the easiest to do, there are two ways to approach weeding. You can do it as a project, where people are assigned very specific tasks to do, and it happens at a very specific time in your fiscal year or in your workflow. We are taking on this project, here's how it's going to happen. Or you can build weeding into your sort of daily or weekly tasks. You can have someone that is responsible for the 700s. Part of what they are supposed to do every week when they have their on-desk time, they need to start off, they need to get a cart, they need to go to the shelf and simply eyeball what looks like it should go. I put a lot of stock in, you are professionals, you are trained, you know your books. You can look at it and say, okay, that's tattered, I don't know that author, you can just see that book's been on the shelf since 1972, et cetera, et cetera. Pull those things off, take them to the desk with you, and you look in the catalog to see, when did it last go out? How long have we had this? What else do I have on the shelf like this? And you can do a lot of that sort of behind the scenes weeding as part of your on-desk task. And the other nice thing about that is then nobody really knows it's going on. You know, it's not obvious that you've pulled 100 books out of the 800s and there's this giant gap. Well, no, I've only pulled 5 this week. No big deal. I've added it to my selection basket for this week. There I'm going to make my $100 goal because I'm replacing these 5 that I've taken out. So there's, you know, it's kind of, there's sort of subtle weeding that can happen and should happen all year round. Does that kind of at least start off helping you with that? So, but we'll have a whole class on weeding.
So you're saying circulation and condition.
Circulation
are
and
the
condition,
two main criteria,
they
but
are.
not the only criteria.
Yes, they are, exactly. Not the only criteria, but that is absolutely the first things you can go off of. There's a lot of, you know, fine points to it, and really a lot of it is looking at, if I take this book off, what else can I either get to replace it, or what else is on the shelf? And that's not to say that you should keep something on the shelf because it's the only thing in that area. I'm on the side that says I would rather have nothing there in like a medical topic, right? I would rather that you don't have any books on diabetes at all than to have 10 books on diabetes from 10 years ago. Because, yeah, yes, computer and medical, oh, please, please. I'd rather have you have nothing because it's, yes. And I never want libraries to have nothing, so for me to say that, it's really, but yeah, condition and circulation.
Well, that's kind of an interesting question because I recently chose to put some books that were from the 80s back on the shelf because I couldn't replace them.
In what topic?
Business.
From the 80s? Really? Like, did they have chapters on fax machines and stuff? Or you mean more like business management? Like,
Business management.
So I would ask you, were those books getting checked out a lot?
No.
Then there's your answer. Then you don't need them. Because people either aren't checking them out because they can tell that they're too old for what they want, or there just isn't the need for that. They feel free to let them go.
Is there a core collection recommended list? I just took over 300s.
Okay.
That hadn't been weeded since I found books on there that were from the 1903, I think was the oldest one I found.
Okay.
And I did, I was trying to do lists, and I said, this isn't gonna work.
Yeah.
So I went to, eyeballing, and
Yeah.
I just pulled anything that was at least before 2000. I wanted to buy, at least before 2010 is what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And my boss said, that's too many.
Right? It's like, why is there nothing on the shelf in the 300s?
So I cut it back to okay, at least 2003, that way, at least I was within this decade, or list.
Yeah.
And then to do replacements, but I didn't know if there's core.
There.
If there's a core collection.
So if I'm not mistaken, someone can look this up real quick. Wilson still comes out with the public library catalog, I think. I don't think that's gone away yet. But, my personal, as a collection development person, my take on those sort of core collection list things, they can be useful, but they're so impersonal, right? Like, they don't know your patrons. Sure. They don't know your needs. And so they can be an interesting springboard, but I would never tell people, well, you must have what's on that list. Like, even the fiction catalog, I was like, no, it's a good place to start, but you don't have to have everything that's in that. And I never used those as weeding criteria. Like, I know a lot of libraries who they've got their cart of fiction books that's ready to go, but then someone needs to check it against fiction catalog. Oh, no, I don't care what fiction catalog says. If your patrons aren't checking it out, you don't have to have it. And that's just me. But you can find the review sources. Booklist, for example, we do core collections. Every issue has a spotlight theme. And so we have, business, for example, and travel and et cetera. And there's always a top 10 list for a core collection in there. And those are always books from the past year that have published and got starred reviews. So that's a good place to start. But no, there really isn't anything that I consider to be a good kind of core collection list. Maybe that needs to be my next book. But see, the problem with that is, right, someone can do it, and then next year it's obsolete. That's why they've kind of sort of fallen out of favor as
I've been using your spotlight.
Yes.
So
Oh, yay, that's good to hear. Woo.
I got 300s and 500s, and I've never, as a government documents librarian, I never had to purchase.
Gotcha. Yeah, the stuff just came to you.
And I'm also the ebook purchaser.
Got
so
it.
I have to get everything.
Yeah.
Plus those two.
So
Yeah.
with your 500s, did you read everything that said that Pluto?
Poor
I was-
Pluto.
It was done before, that was rated before I got it.
Poor Pluto.
And, yeah,
And the poor Brontosaurus. It's
exactly.
no longer a dinosaur. Right, yeah. She's like, I don't care, I didn't hear that, I didn't. Yes, yes.
And I was trying to get corporate.
And that's hard, right? Because you kind of think of like your books on the planets and stuff as those are the things that can stay, even if the copyright is from whenever, because that never changes. Oh, oops. So I thought I saw a hand up over here. Yes.
I just wanted to ask whether you or anyone has thoughts or pros, cons about centralized collection development versus possibly having, several branches with a number of different people from each branch doing collection, kind of looking in between. Right?
Yeah, centralized collection versus doing your own thing at a branch. Is that,
Right
yeah.
now there's about 30 some odd people who do various and sundry orders.
Yeah, see, and that's a lot, isn't it? And is that why you're asking?
Well,
It-
for Republic, which is
okay,
a
yeah,
branch,
big system. And you have 3 branches?
branches plus
So-
some express center.
Yeah, and I think, so the difficult thing about going to centralized is how do you, and it's not difficult, I shouldn't even approach it that way, I won't be
I came
negative.
from a branch that had centralized
Okay.
collection development, so I'm just kind of curious as to what other people.
So the thing about centralized is, I love to see when there is some kind of a hybrid. Centralized selection can be very good because it's very consistent and it makes sure that the budget is spent as wisely as possible. I think when you have a lot of people with different budget allocations, it's easy to get, like I was talking about before, too much overspent in one section and not enough in another. But when it comes to somewhere that has not only a main library but also branches, there has to be some kind of individual control retained so that there is a selector at that, or several selectors at that branch who has the freedom and the money to buy stuff outside of that central purchase as well. Does that make sense? Especially when it comes to things like fiction, right? I could give you a list of 100 authors that are going to come out this year that all of your branches should have that. They will be popular enough. These are good books that every library should have. But, what about branch A that has a really huge Latino population and they want more of this book? Or, branch B that has almost no young adult circulation. We only want the basics in that. Then I'd rather see that money spent somewhere else. Or whatever. Like it's good if you can blend it. There's nothing wrong with centralized collection development as long as there's some kind of hybrid that allows for some individuality as well. I know that's kind of a generic answer to your question, but having worked in both, when I was at Chicago Public, I don't think that they do it this way anymore either. But back then, as I alluded to briefly, we had centralized collection development that was based off of, there are 2 regionals in the system. There's Harold Washington and then there's 2 regionals. And then at the time, there were 78 branches, which I think might be up past 80 now. But they all had designations as a large branch, medium branch, small branch. And so it was kind of we built it up in layers. Everybody got these 50 books every month. And then the small branches also got this, and then the medium got all that plus this, and then the large got that plus this. And so we kind of, built it up that way so that the collections had a corresponding number of items. But at the time, and again, I don't think it's this way anymore, at the time, each budget also had X number of dollars that they could spend as they saw fit. And what we would do to kind of rein in a little bit of control was we would create selection lists from our vendor. And it was like this 2-tiered system, right? The vendor, we happened to use Ingram at the time, I think. Don't even quote me on that. It was a long time ago. The vendor would give us, here are 100 books that are coming out in May that we think are appropriate for a library such as Chicago Public. And then my job was to go through and say, okay, out of those 100, these 50 are things that we really should be concentrating on. And then the branches could spend their money on anything from that list. And then they also had leeway to spend Okay, and what they would do is say, okay, I need books on X. I've got, my neighborhood school has a huge science fair coming up in May, and it's January, and I know I'm gonna need those books in time. I need to get, at least 20 more books in that I can use for science experiments. So they had some individuality. Does that sort of help? Does anybody have anything else that they could offer for that?
Did you say you're from Aurora? Public? So before I came to Rails, I worked at Naperville, so very similar in that 3 branches, very large. We had a centralized model up until about 2 years ago, and then decided to move to a decentralized model, moving from 4 collection development coordinators now to trying to involve 75 or 80 people. And it quickly became apparent that that was just, from a budget standpoint and otherwise, very hard to manage. So I think what we settled in on is really something of a hybrid model where we had a collection development coordinator that sort of did the overseeing and handled certain things herself or himself, but then some responsibilities for the librarians at each of our 3 facilities. So I would agree with Rebecca. A hybrid model is ultimately what probably works best. But I encourage you, if you want to talk to someone, Naperville might be a good one because they're similar size. They have multiple branches because that all makes it a little more tricky. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you can have one person who is selecting everything.
Yeah.
The group that I came from was they had centralized collection development, but we were always encouraged, hey, there's, so-and-so author, we're gonna need more of these.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So you had one person who was really in charge of doing ordering, but selection was allowed, which I just wanted to see what other people are.
And I'll say, too, that part of the decision came from the fact that, as library staff, as librarians, collection development, those things are often what got us into the field, important to us. And so, from a recruitment standpoint, or even just kind of a employee retention and all those things, it was important for us to get our librarians some more experience, and them being the ones on the desk and interacting with patrons.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard, as good as I think our collection development coordinators were, they still worked out of technical services, and they didn't have that. They can read the reviews, they can go online and read those things, which is certainly important, but something to be said for being able to assess your community when the people that are on the desk talking to your patrons are at least in some part making those decisions.
Absolutely. When you're on the desk, you're the front lines. You know what people are asking you for. You know what people are walking away without because you don't have it. You know what people, what authors they're interested in, and nothing really beats that kind of frontline experience to be able to create that collection.
Any final questions here for Rebecca?
Yes.
Yep.
What do you suggest for manga? Because it's so big and everything's like 75 books. And
Yeah, I'm gonna say I don't have a lot of experience in that, so I don't have an answer for you. Right, I really don't know what to tell you on that because when you're talking about like smaller series, like a fiction series, I have plenty of advice on that. But something, where it's a series of 75 different manga and aren't there offshoots and all kinds of stuff? Yeah, Godspeed and good luck. I think really, you just sort of do your best to keep up with when things are coming out, and if it's things that, do you have it in a young adult collection or is it separate? Okay. Rely on those teens to tell you, hey, because they're gonna know long before you can even purchase it when something is coming out. Maybe think about, do you have a YA like council or group or, oh, you've tried, okay. Yeah, because that would be my suggestion is to kind of get them on board and invested in that to help you, but I'm sorry, does anybody have any, helper?
Well, Park Library, we have been on the forefront of manga and animation.
Awesome.
We had got a grant back in 2003, like $14,000. And we have a huge graphic novel collection we still do. And I have a wonderful young tech teen librarian, and this is all she does. This is her collection development.
Great.
Y'all go to the library, go on C2E2, go to the Comic-Con convention for Professional Day.
Wow, that's awesome.
Some of the shows, dynamic migration. But I can give you my card and you can call Ashley. She'll help you. She'll be glad to help you, okay?
Fantastic.
Let me put her name on there.
Hooray.
And then I had a question.
Yes.
Do you have a huge impact, Booklist, your reviews, do you have a huge impact on the ALA winners and the book winners in January? Like, does your reviews have impact on who's going to be selected?
You know, I don't really know. It's not like it's an inside thing. I'm sure we work closely. The book awards come through RUSA, the Reference User Services Association, and we have a relationship with them because we're both under the ALA umbrella. And I can only actually speak from my section that I do. So in reference, the RUSA award for that is the Dartmouth Award for Reference Services, and I happen to have personal relationships with the people that are on the committee. The committee chair and previous committee chair have written for me, actually. They've written reviews and feature articles for me. And so I had asked them ahead of time, you know, I know you can't tell me who your runners-up are, but can you kind of give me an idea of who I should make sure we have Booklist reviewed of? And so we kind of worked that way, but we don't have any influence on who actually gets awarded the award. The committees work solely independently on that. One of the things that Booklist does do, we co-sponsor with RUSA the Carnegie Medals for fiction and nonfiction. And we have a big part in that because the committee is made up of 6 people plus a chair, and 3 of the people are RUSA members and the other 3 are Booklist editors. I was on the committee for the first 2 years. And the way that the list for that is narrowed down is they come from books that are on the RUSA Notables selection list, half of them, and then the other half are from Booklist starred reviews during the year. So we have an influence on what gets chosen for that. But otherwise, the awards are done independently by committees. And we like to think that the reviews will influence them positively. But yeah, we don't have a direct correlation with who the winner is. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I hope that this was informative and that you enjoyed the session. And please go ahead and email me if you have any questions afterwards or anything you'd like to tell me about.